that doomsday clock they talk about was not designed in heaven. The time was set at 7 minutes to midnight and 47. Many near catastrophes have come along the way. Now climate change is ticking several seconds off each day.
Yeah, as I was saying, the expression you hear these days is the revolution will not be televised. Well, that may be so, but there's one coup that was YouTubeized, and that's the coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February 2014. The Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, a protege of Hillary Clinton, had bragged in late 2013 that $5 billion, again, B as in boy, $5 billion had been invested in Ukrainians' aspirations to join the West. That's interesting. We know about the National Endowment for Democracy. Really, that's kind of heir to what we used to call the Covert Action Staff, the CIA. They fund all kinds of people who do color revolution type things, okay? And we know of about 65 projects that the National Endowment for Democracy had going in the Ukraine. So, after Putin bailed Obama out at the end of 2013, the plans went forward at a hastened tempo to do a coup in Kiev. There had been kind of an arrangement where the president of Ukraine thought maybe he'd like to do an economic agreement with NATO or with the EU, but found out what it would cost to Ukraine and decided no, he'd stay in the orbit of Russia. And so a coup there was all kinds of demonstrations on the Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, was giving out chocolate chip cookies to get the energy level up on the Maidan, right, the big square. So on the 4th of February, there's put up on YouTube a conversation between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, our U.S. ambassador in Kiev, Ukraine. And Victoria Nuland says, we've got it glued now. Looks good. Yats is the guy. He knows about the central bank. He knows the need for austerity. Have Klitschko and the others wait in the wings. They're going to be useful, but Yats is the guy. And then she says, now, we've got plans for the UN to come in. And Pyatt says, well, you know, the European Union, she says, fuck the EU. We've got the UN in now, and it's going to be fine. Now.
Be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it, and
And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
Fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And again,
now, was that an authentic conversation? Well, Victoria Nuland did apologize for using curse words with respect to the EU. She did acknowledge it, in other words, as being authentic. This is the 4th of February. Now, when I learned of that, I said, well, it looks like a coup is coming, but at least Yats, the fellow's name is Yatsenyuk, at least he's out of the running now. I mean, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind would kind of say, well, you know, if you're intercepted in a conversation as being the budding prime minister of a country that's just about to get a overthrown government, then in my day we don't say overthrowing governments anymore. We say regime change. So if there's going to be a regime change, well, it's a little bit too embarrassing to have the new presumptive prime minister mentioned 2 weeks before. And so if there's a coup, well, I wake up on the 23rd of February 2014, And I turned the radio on, and there's been a coup in Kiev for the day before, 22nd. And there's a new prime minister. And he's already been recognized by the United States government. What's his name? Yats! Yatsenyuk, okay? So I said, this is incredible. I double-checked it, and then I wrote an article that said, yikes, it's Yats! I mean, what could be more transparent, right? Now, what did he do? First thing he did, so I think it might be a good idea to join NATO. And, I think we ought to ban Russian as a official language. So there were a lot of people who didn't like this coup. And now they're called pro-Russian separatists. Or all they really are anti-coup nationalists, okay? Anti-coup people who want a degree of autonomy in the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, how did the U.S. media play this? Well, the whole thing was, Russia's reacting to this in a very bad way. Putin bad, Putin very bad. Putin ride horse, sometimes have no shirt on, sometimes have no shirt on while riding horse. Putin bad, okay? Now, what does Putin do? Well, if you were Putin, what would you do? Here you are, Ukraine, it's really where the common Slavic civilization began. Ukraine, always part of Russia or the Soviet Union. Before Khrushchev, for political reasons, in '53, right after he took over from Stalin, had decided, well, let's take the Crimea and give it to Ukraine. I mean, I get some political points that way, and no plebiscite, no nothing, And so that was a decree, and so it's an accident of history, 1953, 54, where Crimea was joined with Ukraine. Now, what's Crimea? Well, Crimea hosts the only ice-free, the only all-weather, all-year naval port for the Russian fleet. Big deal. It was Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century, same time we were having our revolution, that brought her reign down to and including Crimea, and started the Black Sea Fleet there. Not only that, but although U.S. ships and other ships are able to go through the Bosporus and visit in the Black Sea, the major naval port there. Their entry into the Mediterranean, everything else. So Obama, we learned later, convened his national security folks on the 23rd of February 2014 and said, what are we going to do about this? Can you envisage Crimea as part of NATO? No way. If they didn't realize we needed to react to this, well, they don't know anything about our strategic interests. So what are we going to do? What they arranged was a plebiscite. Now, they knew, hands down, that most of the Crimeans would vote to rejoin Russia, but they went through the motions at least, and indeed, 96% of the vote said, yeah, we want to rejoin Russia, and so they did, about a month later. Now, how did the U.S. press play this? Well, there was an article in the Washington Post, and it said, headline, Putin admits he had planned well in advance to seize Crimea. Wow. First sentence. In a video released by Russian television, Putin shows that he convened his national security advisors and they planned for the seizure of Crimea, blah, 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 on the 23rd of February, so well before they seized Crimea, 23rd or 30th, well, never mentioned in this article is what happened on the 22nd of February. like there was a coup on the 22nd of February, and if Putin had not convened his national security advisors on the 23rd, he would be extremely derelict in his duty. They're not about to let Crimea go into NATO. Now, he said so. He said two things which are really important. One was sort of in a jocular way. He said, NATO sailors, I'm sure, are terrific guys. And I don't mind them visiting Crimea, Sevastopol, where we have a naval base. But I really much prefer it to be like it is now, where they can visit our naval base in Sevastopol, instead of having our guys, who are also wonderful guys, visit a NATO base in Sevastopol. Thank you very much. Now, the more important thing is that in an interview at about this time, Putin also said, look, one of the main reasons, actually just as important, if not more important, as preventing Ukraine from getting into NATO was our fear of the anti-ballistic missile system that the US and NATO wants to set up around our periphery. We didn't want Crimea to be a site of part of that anti-ballistic missile system, which we believe is not defensive in nature, but actually preparatory to a possible first strike to prevent our retaliatory capability. So this is big stuff. It was very big stuff, and my point here is that people who read the Washington Post out of the blue know, what do they know? They know that Putin got his national security advisors together on the 23rd of February, and they don't know what happened the day before, like the most, well, what George Friedman from Stratfor has called the most blatant coup in human history. Why? Because that conversation between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt was intercepted, probably by the Russian service, so that you can put up on YouTube. What really matters here is what Americans know about all this, and they know next to nothing. They think, well, they've been told how many times, Putin very bad, Putin invade Ukraine. How do we know that? Well, the head of NATO said that. Was he telling the truth? No, he was lying. He didn't invade Ukraine. At most, they sent some soldiers in there to help the people in East Ukraine defend themselves against an onslaught from the government, Kiev, okay? So here's an example. I'm at a kind of a seminar with some very progressive Americans, well-educated, very progressive. And a professor from one of the universities in Washington gets up, and she's talking about foreign policy, and she says, now, I want to tell you that I'm very proud of my son. He's only 10 years old. And he came back from Sunday school last Sunday, and he had made a poster, and it said, Mr. Putin, don't you know thou shalt not kill? And everybody kind of, like progressive friends, all saying, oh yeah, well. So, skunk at the picnic again, and raised my hand and say, no, what's your illusion? She said, Ukraine, of course, Ukraine. The seizure of Crimea. So I said, well, how many people got killed? She said, well, hundreds, probably thousands. I said, well, would you believe 0? No. Nobody could, no. I said, well, you know, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. 0 people got killed by the, quote, seizure of Crimea. Well, well, you know, it was very disconcerting because those are the facts, but all these Americans, including progressive Americans, couldn't believe it. Why? Because it wasn't in the New York Times, because it isn't anything they hear on the boob tube in the afternoon or evening, okay? So here's an example of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Russian attack or offensive against Crimea, you know, Americans have a totally different opinion from what in reality happened. Now, did the Russians orchestrate a very clever seizure of Crimea? They did. Did they invade? No, they didn't. Why? They were entitled to have 25,000 troops in Crimea under a bilateral accord with Ukraine. They were already there. What did they do? They took off their insignia, and they what they call these green-clad troops went to the various ministries in Crimea and said, "I'm sorry, but we're taking over now. There's been a coup in Kiev. We don't agree with it, and so would you please just realize that." Now, there was very little resistance to that. There was some resistance, but no shots fired, okay? So that's how it happened. And then when the plebiscite was held, the referendum, and the Crimea said, no, we'd like to rejoin Russia, well, that was a natural outcome of that. Now, do I look on all that as a favorable thing? No, I don't. I mean, you don't change borders lightly. But think of what would have happened if Russia or China mounted a coup in Mexico City or in Ottawa, okay? And right on our doorstep decided to infringe on our sovereignty in that kind of way. What would our reaction have been? So this just by way of saying that if people didn't realize how strongly any Russia, Soviet Union, Russia would react to the prospect of losing their only warm-water naval base in Crimea, plus lots of air bases and stuff there, their dominance of the Black Sea. If anyone thought that Putin or anybody else would have simply said, oh, okay, well, you want to join NATO? Well, that makes it difficult for us, but okay. They're crazy, don't know anything about Russian history. So was it a deliberate provocation? Of course it was. Who was behind it? Victoria Nuland and all the others that were really, really angry at the Russians for for helping Obama avoid war in Syria. Now Israel plays into this, doesn't it? Because that war in Syria was for Syria, was mostly for Israel's interests, not for our own. So Nuland is an arch neocon, just like Lieberman, just like Wolfowitz, the people I mentioned before, and that was part of it to get back at Putin and put him in his place and say, look, we can do regime change in Moscow as well, and you have the head of the National Endowment for Democracy, which, as I mentioned before, had 65 projects sprinkled throughout the Ukraine before the coup. The head of that, Gerstein is his name, he bragged about, look, Ukraine is good, but Putin might have to reckon with the same kind of Maidan uprising demonstrations right on Red Square. There might be a color revolution right there in Moscow, and that's their eventual aim. Ironically, what they've done is made Putin much stronger. He's got unparalleled, unprecedented support among the Russian people for his foreign policy, domestic policy, something different, but he's never enjoyed such high approval ratings. It has become the policy of the American media to demonize Putin, to make him the devil incarnate. It's almost as though if Putin were to be observed by Western journalists walking on top of the Moscow River to his office in the Kremlin, the headline the next day would be, Russian president clearly doesn't know how to swim. It's that bad. One of the reasons that Obama and Putin have been able to get along, despite some of their advisors, is that Putin helped Obama a great deal get out of that fix that he got himself into over Syria. You'll recall that Obama was on the verge of pressing the button for war against Syria, overt war, not a covert war. And Putin decided that he would persuade Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, to relinquish his chemical weapons and give them over to the United States to be destroyed on a U.S. ship. That happened. After that happened, that all happened at the beginning of September 2013. On the 11th of September 2013, Putin wrote an op-ed that appeared in the New York Times. And this was the flourishing of a relationship that he had proved could be very useful to the United States. And so he waxed eloquent about the ability of the United States and Russia to work together to prevent a war in the Middle East, because that's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And it was a very interesting op-ed, and far more interesting than the body of the op-ed was the last paragraph. And it said, you know, the only thing that we basically disagree on is the United States claim to be the sole indispensable country in the world. The idea that the United States is exceptional. I, Vladimir Putin, don't believe that there is any reason to say one country is more exceptional than the other. I think we're all the same under God's purview, and that some are more advanced democratically than others, but that in God's eyes, we're all equal. Period. And I mean, it's a virtual quote. I don't have it exactly. Now, I learned subsequently, he wrote that himself. I mean, he added that, like, you know. I mean, he had a speechwriter do the other stuff. Now, what does that mean? It goes to the very core of things here. What makes the United States exceptional? Why does the president always finish his speeches by saying, "And God bless America"? There's something profoundly wrong from a theological perspective on that. Number one, there's nothing in the Hebrew or Christian scriptures that encourages us or allows us to use the imperative mood with God, you know? I mean, you can figure it out. You don't tell God what to do. You don't say, "God bless America." The other people, if you want to, fine. But, hey, God, bless America because we're exceptional, because we're the city on the hill, because we're the sole remaining superpower in the world. That ain't theologically sound. And, you know, what I'd love to see is, and I dare say Vladimir Putin would like to see, is the President of the United States say, "God bless everybody." And then if he wants to say, and especially America, that's okay, but God bless everyone. Now, here's Putin, arch-communist originally, ruling Russia now, and he's actually an Orthodox Christian. And he's saying, look, Mr. Obama, I agree, we can cooperate. Look what we just did in averting a war against Syria. Let's cooperate here, but let's recognize that you can't really cooperate if one side considers themselves indispensable and considers everybody else, well, that's an interesting thing. I talk a lot at colleges, right? And some of these kids don't have the grammar training that I had. And so I say, anybody know what a synonym is? And they say, oh yeah, wow, that's, it's a words like. How about antonyms? And, usually one kid will come up and say, yeah, that's the opposite. I said, yeah, right, good. So what's the antonym for indispensable? And they go, dispensable? I say, yeah, right. So when we say the United States is the sole indispensable country in the world, what do we say about the other countries? That they're dispensable? Yeah, that's right, that they're dispensable. Hello? Now that's the attitude. And that's the attitude that people like Putin observe and have to take into account when they're looking after their own national interests. So, Mr. Putin has shown himself, in my view, as a very restrained statesman with sang-froid that won't quit. I've seen him under severe provocation, i.e. mounting a coup on his doorstep. Now, people say, well, the Ukraine, Kiev, that's Russia's backyard. Well, it ain't Russia's backyard, it's the front yard, folks. That's where everyone from Napoleon, Hitler, and before them, the Swedes and the Lithuanians and Poles, is where they all came in through there. So Ukraine is, not just another country, it's the soft underbelly of Russia. And if US policymakers were surprised that Putin reacted by making sure that Crimea was not forfeited to NATO, well, that just shows that they're adolescent in terms of understanding Russian national interests and Russia's determination to protect its national interests.
Tuesday clock whose consequence is worse than a third world